CNS, and welcome to our course, a virtual visit from acclaimed writer and activist Laura Bates. So welcome, Laura. Good afternoon.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
No, it's a pleasure. What Laura is going to talk to you about, and it is very much an opportunity for you to ask questions after Laura and I have chatted for a bit, is to talk about her work in the area of sexism. Laura is the founder of a project that has now taken on the significance globally and become part of a global movement. What started as the Everyday Sexism project is now being recognized in other countries, and it's part of a move towards wider gender-based equality. So obviously it fits in very well and is an example of potential differences or imbalances when it comes to power. Okay, so I hope that this talk will provide you with another example or another reference point to write about in your work. Okay, so Laura, can I begin by asking you and you sharing with us how the Everyday Sexism project started?
Yeah, absolutely. It started in early 2012, and it came about after a week in which I had a number of really negative experiences that happened quite close together. There were actually even more than I kind of normally talk about. It was actually more like a kind of 2-week period where a whole load of different things just happened to occur quite close together. So, for example, one of them was being followed home by a man who jumped off the bus at my stop. He obviously wasn't getting up, and he saw me getting off the bus and suddenly hopped off as well and started following me home and really aggressively sexually propositioning me, refusing to take no for an answer, and eventually just basically saying, well, I'll follow you home and then I'll always know where you live. There's nothing you can do about it. There was another event very close to that in time where I was on the way home quite late at night on the bus. I was on the phone to my mum and didn't really notice that the man next to me was sitting a bit uncomfortably close until I suddenly looked down and realised that he had his hand between my legs. And I stood up and moved away from him. And because I was on the phone, I was in that bubble of talking to my mum where I wasn't quite thinking like I was in a public space. So I said what had happened out loud in a way I might not have otherwise felt brave enough to do. So I said, I'm on the bus. This man just groped me. And everybody on the bus heard, and everybody looked away. Nobody stepped in, nobody challenged him, nobody even made eye contact with me. And it sent me such a powerful message. This is normal. This is your thing to deal with. Don't bring this up. Don't expect anybody else to get involved. It made me feel so embarrassed that I shouldn't have said anything, that perhaps it was my fault. I was wearing the wrong thing or in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I got off the bus at the next stop and walked the rest of the way home. And looking back on that, I realized it wasn't even as much the initial assault, because I now know that under UK law, that is what it was, a sexual assault, even though at the time, the normalization of those kinds of incidents in my life meant that I never would have used that terminology to describe it, which of course is part of the problem. But it was the fact that I got this incredibly powerful message from other people around me that was almost just as impactful, going, this is your fault, this is your thing to deal with, don't speak up about it. And of course, that the man on the bus got an incredibly powerful message that night as well, which was, you can do this and get away with it. Even if the person says out loud what's happening, nobody will step in or challenge you. And a few days later, I was walking down the street in broad daylight and some men were unloading some scaffolding off the back of a truck. And as I walked past, one of them very explicitly made a comment about my breasts to the other, and they started discussing me in a really kind of invasive and sexual way. And I was right there. I mean, I could hear them. I was obviously right in front of them, and there wasn't any awkwardness or tension. It wasn't as if they thought that I might respond, or it was almost like they thought that it wouldn't matter whether I heard or not. There was no sense that I might be upset or say anything back. It was just normal. That word normal I kept coming back to. You're in a public space and you're a woman, so we can talk about you in any way you like. That's normal. And because these things happen so close together, I started thinking about them and thinking, why is it normal? And why specifically am I so used to this stuff happening over the days and the months and years, to these kinds of experiences that invade my space, that make me feel unsafe, that make me feel isolated, pursued, scared for my safety, uncomfortable, embarrassed? Why am I so used to them that if they hadn't happened in the same week, I probably never even would have thought twice about any one of those things? Because it was normal. Why was it normal? Why would I not even tell someone that something like that had happened to me? And the conclusion I came to was that it was part of being a woman. It had been a part of my life since I was in my early teens. And this made me start wondering why, in 2012, as it was then, it was so normal that I just accepted it. And I started talking to other women and girls and asking them if they'd ever had similar experiences. And I honestly thought a few of them might have a story to tell me. And instead, it was every woman I spoke to. And it wasn't one story from a few years ago. It was, yeah, this happens every day. This just happened on my way to meet you. Or every day in the workplace, the men in my office will go to a strip club at lunchtime and they take clients there. So I just miss out on those deals. It was these kinds of very normalized, oh, yeah. And when I said things like, isn't there anything you could do about that? Couldn't you complain? They would say, well, I probably could technically, but I just wouldn't have a long career at the company. It would just damage my career. I'd be seen as a troublemaker, as rocking the boat. Everybody laughs stuff like this off. They call it banter. And so I started to realize two things. First, that the problem was much greater than I'd recognized in my own personal experience of it. And second, that it was silenced, that these experiences weren't being talked about. And a huge number of the women I spoke to made a point of saying to me, until you asked me, I've never told anyone about these experiences before because it's just normal. So I came up against this word normal, normal, normal. And when I started trying to disrupt that normalization, when I started trying to talk about this as a kind of broader problem and using the term sexism to describe it, because it seemed to me fair to say that these were people being discriminated against or treated differently because of their sex, I came up against huge resistance. People said sexism doesn't exist anymore, especially in this country. A lot of people said, look elsewhere, look at other countries if you want to see women with real problems. Women here have never had it so good. So I felt like there was this odd clash between the ongoing and systemic oppression and inequality impacting women's lives, and at the same time, this public perception that that was a form of inequality that just didn't exist. And I didn't think I could fix the problem or solve sexism overnight, but I thought, what if I could do something smaller and just get people to see it? Wouldn't that be an important first step? Because how can we solve a problem if most people think it doesn't even exist? And that's what the Everyday Sexism was an attempt to do. It was an attempt to give other people the experience I'd had when I heard all these stories from different people from different walks of life. It really opened my eyes to the fact that these weren't one-off individual coincidences. They were part of a much wider systemic problem. And starting the project was an attempt to create that awareness of the problem more widely than myself. And I thought that perhaps 50 or 60 people would share their stories. And instead, it went completely sort of viral. It snowballed very quickly, and hundreds of thousands of people shared their stories. So it became the biggest data set of its kind that had ever been created, and has been used ever since, really, to try and drive this awareness raising and sense of kind of cultural shift in our attitudes towards women.
Thank you. I mean, if I just pause for a moment and try and show some of the examples that you capture in your book. I mean, what you can see, folks, on the screen, hopefully, is a snapshot of the book dedicated to this topic, Everyday Sexism. And am I right in saying, Laura, that the tweets that are captured here, they came in directly to you? So these are kind of literally the voice of the people who've experienced things like this.
Yes, absolutely. So these are first person accounts, which I think is what makes it so powerful, really, that it's a sense of collective voice. It's people's experiences in their own words.
And how did I mean, obviously you launched the website. I'm assuming then that it generated more coverage and more sort of activity from through word of mouth, was it?
Yes, I think it's a real testament to the sheer number of these stories, but also to the fact that they really had been dismissed, belittled, disbelieved, brushed under the carpet, that there was this collective yearning for a kind of outpouring, really. I think that's the only way you can explain why what happened, because I had no funding, I had no advertising, I had no experience of doing anything like this. I literally just put the website live. I put it on my own Facebook page with my 300 friends or whatever. And I started a brand new Twitter account with no followers to start kind of amplifying the stories that we received. So I think the fact that it spread in the way it did is a real testament to just how bad the problem was and just how little outlet there was for it. And of course, it then kind of snowballed. So it first got picked up in the UK by the Times, and then it spread to the other national newspapers. And then suddenly it was being reported on in, the Times of India or the New York Times or Glamour South Africa or, French Grazia magazine. And at that point, we'd start having a kind of bombardment of stories from women in those countries saying, we've heard about what you're doing and we need this here too. So we then started kind of chapters or branches of the project in different countries around the world run by local activists. And it very much kind of grew organically from there.
And when you were receiving word from other countries, I mean, obviously, certain cultures have certain cultural practices that are unique to them. But if you were doing a kind of a thematic comparison, were the same messages and the same kind of examples being shared?
Absolutely. It was incredibly similar and very moving, actually, to realise the extent to which it really was a universal problem. In the same week, we heard from a woman in India who'd been groped whilst riding a rickshaw, and a woman in London who'd had a man slow down at traffic lights and wind down his car window to grope her as she sat on her bike. There were just so many similarities. Of course, there are particular areas where particular issues were more prominent in different countries, but actually the overwhelming message was just the sheer similarity and particular themes that cropped up again and again from around the world as well. The number of women who had been blamed for what had happened to them, victim shaming and blaming, the silencing of stories and of survivors, and the normalization, this crushing normalization. We heard from a woman in Germany who said that she used the word normal to describe being groped if she wanted to go out on a night out. We heard from a woman in Argentina who tried to ignore four men catcalling her from their car, only to find that they screeched to a halt and tried to drag her in. From a woman in Mexico who was told by her university professor, Calladita te ves más bonita, you look prettier when you shut up. We heard from a woman in India who was too afraid to report the man with the erection pressed into her back on a crowded train. Again, something that we hear from women on public transport in every country around the world, including in the UK, or 12 and 16-year-old sisters who tried to picnic in a public park in France when a man came and exposed himself to them. So again and again, we were seeing very much the same kind of stories and themes cropping up all around the world.
And your I suppose initial desire was to, please correct me if I'm wrong, but was to register the prevalence of sexism, but also to provide a space where it can be captured. So presumably when people write in with an entry, it's there forever, as it were. So it's kind of evidenced.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was kind of a two-pronged approach at first. It was partly for people who didn't know this was going on to try and demonstrate and prove just how bad the problem was. But it was also for people who were experiencing this and who had so frequently being blamed, ignored, dismissed, belittled when they spoke about their experiences, hopefully a cathartic space intended to give them a sense of reclaiming of their story and of being heard, often for the first time. And that's why the site was designed very deliberately in a very simplistic way, where you couldn't ever reply or respond to somebody else's story, where there were no comments, there was no way of contacting somebody, because it felt really important and quite radical for a woman to be able to say, this is what happened to me, and nobody to have the option to say, oh, I don't believe you, or why didn't you just do this or that and it wouldn't have happened. So those were the kind of two aims originally. It was very much that kind of space for holding testimonies on behalf of survivors. And we would hear from women, one woman wrote in her 80s to say that for her life, she had carried with her the pain of a sexual assault. never feeling able to talk about it because she had been made overwhelmingly as a teenager to feel that it was her own fault what had happened to her. And that this was the first time seeing this collective, these stories, this kind of outpouring of other women's grief and anger, was the first time that she'd felt that it wasn't her fault and that she wasn't to blame, and that had lifted something, a great burden from her. So there was that kind of focus on what the project could do for survivors as well as what it could do to raise awareness more widely.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, before we look at some of the responses to the project, I just want to, and I'm sure you can speak about this far better than I can, but where your project is significant, as well as providing a space for women to talk about their experiences, is that you as a theorist, from what I understand, argue that sexism is not just a situation where it's men versus women. It's much more complicated than that, or much more needs to be done in terms of redressing power. And there is an interesting chapter in the book where you actually pose the question, what about men too? Or what about men? And then you give statistics. I hope you can see some of them, folks, on the screen, where you highlight that sexism as a social force doesn't benefit doesn't benefit people, regardless of how they choose to identify. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, in terms of, because I know in some of the tweets that I've seen, I wasn't able to capture them, but there were comments from men who were disgusted by what they were reading and what they were seeing, and they wanted to be part of the change to kind of move things on as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we receive and publish entries from people of all genders, which I think is really important. The responses we receive from men tend to fall into kind of three camps. They're either men who have been really shocked by the project, and that's great because it kind of confirms that the awareness raising element of it is working. Men who are furious and disgusted and want to be part of changing things. Or they're men who have sisters, daughters, mothers, colleagues, friends who have experienced this and who are furious on behalf of women in their own lives. Or in many cases, men who have themselves experienced adversity as a result of gender stereotypes. So, for example, men who work in female-dominated professions like nursing, for example, who often experience different forms of prejudice, of stigma, of bullying. Men who themselves have been survivors of sexual violence is another category of entries we get. And I think if you look at the stories we receive, what they show is that these are all part of the same problem. So, as you say, there is this very outdated, very sort of superficial idea in the media and kind of pushed on the internet quite deliberately that this is about men against women. It's gender wars. It's the battle of the sexes. And the mainstream media deliberately sets it up in this way because it creates this idea of a kind of controversy that gathers them clickbait and more views, which is incredibly frustrating. Because the reality is that this is not about men against women, that it's much more complicated than that. It's not about saying that all women are victims or for 1 second that all men are perpetrators. It's about recognizing that this is a gendered issue. So we realize that it does disproportionately impact women, but that also it within that sweeps up and has a negative impact on men as well. So, for example, we think of something like body image as a teenage girl's problem, but actually the statistics show it also has a massive impact on young men and boys as well. So often the issues we're talking about and tackling when we talk about sexism are actually things affecting all of us, and tackling them would be beneficial for all of us.
Yeah.
But more than that, when you look at the issues that do specifically and disproportionately impact men and boys, which you will often see held up online as a kind of trump card against feminism, the most common being, how can you bang on about women's rights and sexism when the male suicide rate is 3 times higher than it is for women? The idea is that if you care about men and the issues facing them, you have to recognize that all this feminist stuff is basically a kind of, it's fraud, it's a conspiracy, it's a lie. Men are the real victims. And if you care about women and girls and the issues they're facing, you must hate men and you don't care about any of those issues.
Yeah.
But the truth is that they're so obviously completely connected. They're not two separate problems set against each other. They are different ripple effects of the same problem. So,
Yeah.
for example, the male suicide rate, we know all of the experts and evidence that we have suggests that it comes in part from the idea that boys don't cry, that we raise men in a world where we tell them they can't be vulnerable, they must be strong and powerful and in control, that it's not manly to reach out for support or to talk about your emotions. And so we know that men are much less likely to get support for mental health problems, which goes a long way to explaining that tragically high male suicide rate. And of course, that boils down to a gender stereotype, and gender stereotypes never exist in a vacuum. They're always two sides of a coin. In this particular case, the other side of the coin being the idea that women are hormonal and hysterical and over emotional and not suitable to particular jobs like working in science labs.
Yeah.
So you recognize that actually this is really all of us in it together. And that isn't to say that we're all facing the same problem or that it manifests itself in the same way for all of us. Because often when I talk about this, people then say, well, why don't you call it equalism then or humanism if it's really about everybody and about reaching a level playing field? The answer to that is that it is. It isn't a trick. If you look up feminism in the dictionary, it means believing that everybody should be treated equally, regardless of their sex. But to get to that level playing field, you've got to recognize where we're coming from, which is here. We have to name a problem to solve a problem. And although men and boys are absolutely specifically and horribly affected by gender stereotypes and by sexism in individual ways, in terms of how the problem manifests itself systemically, by which I mean how it's written into and baked into the institutions in our society, our politics, economics, professional and cultural lives, it disproportionately impacts women and girls. Women and girls are the vast majority of survivors of sexual violence, for example, and the men and boys who experience sexual violence are themselves most likely to be survivors of male sexual violence. So we have to recognize what the problem is to fix it, but that doesn't mean that it's about men against women for 1 second. It very much is about all of us in this together trying to make things better for everybody.
Yeah, and certainly for conveniently for us folks, as Laura's saying, the issue seems really about power. You know, being able to recognize that there are power imbalances between us, but if we're going to move forward, we have to kind of reimagine or try and come up with ways of, you know, sharing that power or new ways of communicating. So if, for example, a female says, I've been a victim of sexual assault or sexism, we get away from the immediate response of, well, men experience it too. So it's not replacing one point of view with another. It's trying to find new ways forward. Before we look at some responses culturally to the project, can I just ask you to share a little bit about your experiences on a personal level about the project? Because I know there have been some unfortunate consequences for you.
Yes, so I suppose I should have said that there are 4 categories of responses that we get from men more accurately. And the final category of response is something that I naively just never anticipated. When I started the project, I was in my early 20s. It was 2012 before kind of online abuse had really hit the headlines or was in the public consciousness in the way that it is now. And I honestly thought, I'm starting a really simple, tiny website where anybody can share their story. Who could possibly be cross about that? And the answer is a lot of people, because from within a few weeks of starting the project, before it had any media attention or had even received 100 entries, I was receiving, on average, about 200 rape and death threats a day. And that has continued for much of the last decade. And
Wow.
it waxes and wanes. So, you know, there'll be times when you have a light day or two. And then if I'm on the television or the radio talking about this stuff, then generally you'll come home to a barrage of rape and death threats. And it's really detailed. I think it's when we talk about online abuse, people often think it's kind of snowflakes who don't like people disagreeing with them online. But I'm talking about men who will write like thousands of word long emails to me talking about how they want to eradicate me from the world, what 7 weapons they'll use to disembowel me with and what order they'll use them in, how they'll track me down and rape me and put the video on the internet, what they'll do to members of my family. And I think it's important to talk about that because it shows that actually for those of us who think this isn't a problem anymore, people aren't really sexist anymore, actually the problem really is still there, and in some ways it's kind of underground and it's gone online, but there are still massive communities of men who really are actively kind of inciting and sharing this hatred of women, and they're not shy about getting in touch if you dare to stand up and just try and talk about this in a very simple and gentle way, you know. And from the very beginning, I've always been very clear that this was about including men, that it wasn't about vilifying men, that we were talking about men's stories as well. And yet that's the extremity of the response that there's been.
I mean, just a comment that came through as you were talking by a student, Alicia, she said, "Ooh, that's not okay." And it's absolutely not. I'm interested how you manage that, in the sense of when you come home and you are confronted with that, have you now developed a kind of blanket response of not responding? Or not that it doesn't hurt you, but presumably you can't respond to every comment that's made, and nor would you want to, I'd imagine. But is there ever a sense of like you feel the need to issue a statement or have a kind of response to that?
Very early on, I used to, and now I'm, I suppose, more used to it and more aware of the structures of how it works, and the fact that in many cases for men who operate in groups, they'll do this as a kind of game, and actually they're looking for a response from you as a way to kind of almost prove themselves to each other. That it can almost be like a turf war in some cases between different groups, online gangs of men who will be competing to see who can eradicate you from the internet fastest, who can get more of a rise out of you. So in most cases now I don't respond. But I think it's really important to say that there just isn't any right or wrong response to this, you know, just in the same way that there isn't to any other kind of harassment or assault. The focus really must be on stopping it from happening in the first place. And however any individual woman responds, you know, I never want to say like, oh, well, you just do this, you just ignore it, you just turn it off, or X or Y. Because the truth is, there are some of these things that now I'm so used to seeing that they don't affect me in the same way anymore. But then there will also be other things that it's impossible not to be affected by because they're so disgusting or so deeply personal. I recently came across a page where it was an entire website just dedicated to men talking about different ways to injure me internally with pieces of furniture. You know, so there will always be something that will shock you more and that will bring it back again. But for me, the thing that feels positive is trying to tackle the roots of it. So, for example, we did a campaign to get Facebook to change its policies on rape and domestic violence content. And that felt like a good way to really kind of actually address the root of the problem in a way that was productive. And I've recently written a book that actually kind of traces the roots of all of this stuff and looks at the communities that are actually sending out these different forms of abuse and what's driving them and what's happening. So it helps me to feel like you're doing something productive. Like for me, that's the coping mechanism, feeling like, yes, this horrible stuff is coming through, but I try to leverage the project entries we receive offline as much as possible to create real change. So we've kind of gone beyond the point of raising awareness now, and we take the stories and we use them to have conversations in schools like this one with young people to try and really kind of create change. Or we take the stories, for example, that we receive from women on public transport and use them to work with the British Transport Police to retrain their officers and to tackle sexual offences differently. So lots of different ways to try and actually, you know, feel that there is positive stuff coming out of this as well, I suppose.
And just to pause you there, I don't know if you can see, but the comments to you are, this woman is so strong and powerful, she doesn't deserve this, she deserves better. This is so disgusting, like when she's trying to do a good thing and having men say things like that. I mean, just to remind you, or not to remind you, but kind of to make you aware, you know, in the dark times, that, you know, it is very much valued. I mean, before we come on to think about the kind of positive impacts of the project and what it's been used for, I just want to put, folks, Laura's comments in context. Now, as I was preparing for this, and getting images and materials together, I came across these websites as an example of the kind of misogyny and the hatred that Laura is talking about now. You know, I mean, initially I thought it was kind of a joke, not that laughing at anything like this is a joke, but you look at it and you realize actually this is totally serious. And this one here, for example, this is a website, Laughing at Feminists, It's Our Civic Duty. And then there are lots of examples where there is nakedly obvious attempts to undermine the efforts of Laura and the Everyday Sexism Project and activism too. And then this one here, I think, is actually from the same person, but this is what the counter groups claim is the real sexism project. And of course, their conception of sexism is that men are actually victims in the same way as men. So like this poster here, and you may be able to see it when I send the PowerPoint around later, this is I would say a deliberate and quite calculated attempt to counter the stereotypical image that women are just the victims of domestic violence. And here you have an image that says, if you ignore half the people, you ignore half the problem. So the inference being that, it's kind of swapping one source of power for another. And if we look at that, we're increasingly told that men and women are equal, that patriarchy doesn't exist anymore or exert the same level of control that it once did. And when you hear Laura's stories and you hear what other people have said through the project and this, it's quite obvious, I think, that power imbalances and power differences still exist. And apologies for the awful pictures, but the very fact that people think it's okay to actually put this up is revealing and sickening within itself. Okay, so let's think about it in more positive terms now. Okay, so can I ask you, Laura, you mentioned about the response and the positive reaction in the sense that people are coming forward and sharing their stories. How has the project been used to influence the powers that be, as it were, in a sense of how it's being used to hopefully bring about change and address many of the issues that are raised by people sharing their stories?
So that's been the really great thing about the project taking off in the way it has, that the intention that it's kind of generated has given the opportunity for these women's stories to be used in a really productive way to create real concrete change, hopefully to prevent future generations of women and girls from going through the same thing. So, for example, I work really closely with government, with ministers, cabinet ministers and MPs on using the stories we've collected to drive policy change. For example, until just a few months ago, there was no legal requirement for schools in the UK to teach young people anything about sexual consent or healthy relationships. The only thing they had to learn at school was the basic biology of sex. And we were receiving tens of thousands of messages from young people at school experiencing sexual violence, experiencing sexual harassment, experiencing.
So
Brilliant.
I
Yes, so I don't know how much you heard, but basically working closely with cabinet ministers to show them in young people's own words why young people desperately needed education around sexual consent and healthy relationships. And for ministers to be able to have that kind of information backed up with tens of thousands of first-person testimonies of sexual violence happening at school and amongst young people's relationships was really, really powerful. And that kind of just hadn't been available before. So there are brilliant women's rights charities who have great statistics, for example, that they want to kind of campaign on. And we were able to come along and work together with them and say, and here are the real stories behind the numbers, which tends to really get people's attention and kind of sharpen an awareness of what we're really talking about. So that worked really well. So after many years of campaigning and really using these stories to work with ministers and with MPs and then with the Department for Education, finally, it was made compulsory for the curriculum to have a much broader range of RSE materials delivered to young people. We also took 2,000 of our entries that were just from women on buses and trains and used them to work really closely with the British Transport Police. And again, it's very pragmatic. So the BTP had done a survey. They knew that sexual harassment and assault was happening on the transport network, but 95% of incidents were unreported. So they didn't really have the detail of the problem that they needed in order to target it. And we had thousands of responses. So we had all the detail and none of the power to change it. So bringing those two things together was very powerful because, for example, we were able to explain the barriers to reporting, the fact that women didn't know who to talk to if something happened while they were on the tube or a bus, and that they were most likely to turn to a bus driver or somebody on the station platform and often weren't getting very good responses from them. And that in turn let BTP recognise that to tackle this wasn't just about training their officers, but actually it was about training frontline staff like bus and train drivers. And when we did that and we worked together, it had a huge impact. And the reports of sexual offences on the transport network went up by about 35%.
Wow.
And so did the detection of offenders, so the number of people they actually caught. And we were able to give undercover officers information about the nature of these kinds of crimes. So it wasn't just someone shouting at someone on a train. It was things like upskirting on escalators, which we knew from our reports was really common at certain tube stations, for example. So that kind of detail made a really big difference when working with police forces. And the other thing that we do is we take the entries we've received and we use them to work with people in other countries. So we've had events at the United Nations and the Council of Europe where we've brought together people from different countries to look at this issue of everyday sexism for the first time, really. But also trying to use the stories in a very granular way, in a way that's really kind of pinpointed. So, for example, we take all the entries that we receive from women working in the law who experience a huge amount of sexism and misogyny, and it's kind of in many ways quite a sort of outdated profession in the way that it's set up. And we'll use them to go into law firms and talk to people about this is specifically what women in law are facing, and looking at ways that organisations and businesses can actually improve their sexual harassment procedures in ways that would be meaningfully useful. So really targeted approaches and trying to have the greatest possible visible real world impact.
Brilliant. I mean, I've just got a couple of questions before I open the floor up to students, but I guess one of the things I wanted to ask you to keep the momentum going and also to ensure that we call out sexism in all its forms, what would your immediate advice be to people who experience it?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is that it can be powerful to know that you're not alone, that this isn't your fault, that there isn't any right or wrong response or anything that you've done to deserve it. Sometimes I think reading the Everyday Sexism Project entries can be a good way to get a sense of that sense of community and other people having your back. I'd say it's worth being aware of your rights, because often we'll find that our experiences are dismissed or belittled when they shouldn't be. And if it happens in a school or a workplace or a college environment, then actually under the Equality Act of 2010, you are protected from that. You are officially, legally, it's the responsibility of that workplace or that school to make sure that you aren't in an environment that is embarrassing, that's making you feel harassed, that's making you feel uncomfortable, that's degrading or humiliating. And sometimes knowing your rights can make you feel more powerful in talking about it if you want to complain about it or raise the issue. You know, this is actually my right not to experience this, and it's your job to do something about it. I would say that sometimes these things can be, instead of one big incident, it's often lots and lots of little things. And that's a really hard thing to protest, because when you name any one of those things, it sounds not particularly like a big deal, but it's the cumulative effect of them building up that has the real impact. In a situation like that, it can be really useful to just keep a running list, keep a notepad where you jot down every time something like this happens, and a note of exactly what was said and when and where you were and if anybody else witnessed it, because presenting a body of evidence like that can be more helpful in forcing people to take it seriously. And I'd also say that if it is something that's a problem affecting more than one person, reporting something together can be a really powerful way to overcome some of that risk, because many women, particularly in a workplace or a school environment, say that they don't feel able to report what's happened in case nobody believes me, no one takes me seriously, I'm laughed at, I end up being bullied worse because I've come forward. And all of those things, which are valid concerns, kind of rely on one person's report being scapegoated. Oh, she's just the rampant feminazi. She's just overreacting. She's rocking the boat. And if a number of women or girls come forward together and say, actually, we've all experienced this, it's a particular issue, it's a systemic issue, then that takes away that kind of fear of one person being scapegoated.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, the main thing is for an organisation, a school, a workplace, to put the procedures and policies in place to try and tackle the problem, and the onus not just being on victims to kind of fix the problem or respond in the right way.
And also making it clear that organizations do have policies in place, because sometimes I've worked in places myself where the culture is kind of very kind of inclusive, or wants to be inclusive, but actually doesn't specify or spell out what they have got in place, or the powers they could use to actually make that happen, beyond kind of people being nice to each other, or diversity training, or what happens if it doesn't work so much. So it's about that too. Just one final thing from me. On the screen I've tried to get a collection of your work that is available at the moment, and the students are going to have access to a copy of your novel, The Burning, in audio format. Could you just give them a brief summary of what that's about and how it links to your other work?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's so nice. Thank you. Well, basically, The Burning grew out of the fact that loads of the project entries we received came from young people, and that really took me by surprise. I thought we'd be mostly hearing from adults, and actually we got so many reports that came from teenagers. And it started from such a young age. And so a lot of my work focused on going into schools and working directly with young people to try and tackle some of these problems and to just listen to them about their experiences. And what I found was absolutely overwhelming, that what people were facing, and girls in particular were facing in and outside of school, remained really massive in a world which was telling them, oh, girls have never had it so good, you should think yourselves lucky. So I wanted to try and rewrite that story. And in particular, this is a story, The Burning, which looks at a very, very common issue that came up in my school visits to hundreds of schools across the UK, which was the issue of sexting and revenge pornography and sharing of images without consent. And literally, there was not a school I went to where that didn't come up in some form. And I felt that the narrative around it was just so messed up and so skewed, because it was very often a huge amount of pressure that girls were under to share these pictures in the first place. If they didn't, they were frigid, they were uptight, they were prudes. If they did, then suddenly the pictures spread like wildfire without their consent, and suddenly they were sluts and whores and slags, and the boys who shared them were heroes and studs and players. And girl after girl I was hearing from who had dropped out of school as a result of this kind of backlash. And I wanted to tell that story in a different way, in a way that said, actually, hang on a minute, this is the wrong way of looking at this. These girls don't have anything to be ashamed of. The people doing this do. And I realized that when I was that age, I wouldn't have been picking up a non-fiction book about feminism, but I did love novels. So I decided to fictionalize that story. And this is the story of a girl called Anna, whose story very much is a kind of composite of thousands of girls I've worked with across the country. But it's also a story about witchcraft, because around the same time I was doing this research and work in schools, I also started researching British witch trials. And it's really shocking to discover, when we think of witch trials, we think of America and Salem, but actually there was a huge, incredibly intense witchcraft frenzy that swept through Europe about 400 years ago. And in Scotland in particular, it was really intense, and thousands of women lost their lives in what was essentially a kind of communal form of performative misogyny. So I found this true story of a girl in Scotland, in a little Scottish fishing village 400 years ago. She was called Maggie Morgan, and she was pursued by a rich local nobleman who was obsessed with her because she was very beautiful, even though she was a poor fisherman's daughter. And he got her pregnant and then left her destitute and alone. And the double standards of the way she was treated, she was called up in front of the church session, she was shamed and called a harlot and a whore, she was made to kind of sit in sackcloth in front of the other parishioners on Sunday. Well, everybody in the town knew who the father of this child was, but they just kind of turned a blind eye. He just got off scot-free. And it really reminded me of the stories I was hearing from teenage girls today. I felt like there were so many similarities in the treatment of these women, even though we're talking about a 400-year period when so little has changed. So this book takes the two stories, a girl today and a girl 400 years ago, and kind of tells them side by side.
Yeah, and it is a gripping read, folks. So I hope you really enjoy listening to it. And I mentioned to Laura earlier that I'd be surprised if it's not picked up by Netflix or something like that, because the visuals and the kind of narrative of it seem to lend itself so well to other formats. When I was reading it, I could see the characters and see certain scenes being played out. Okay, well, that's it from me in terms of questions. Now, what I'd like to do is invite you, the students, to ask any questions that you might have of Laura, either about the project or her work in other areas. So we've got just under 10 minutes for questions. So if you want to ask a question about anything, please feel free. Don't be shy. Just raise your hand or type them into the chat function. Okay. There's always that awkward silence, first of all. Any questions? Okay. Laura, did you find writing a fiction novel, even though it's based in truth, easier than writing kind of an academic book?
It was very different. It felt more difficult in some ways because with the non-fiction book, I knew exactly what would be in each chapter, and whenever I sat down to write it, that chapter would have looked the same. Whereas with the fiction, it felt like I kind of knew what was in it, but how it came out could be completely different, you know, whether I sat down on a Saturday evening or a Tuesday morning, and that felt quite freeing, but also quite scary because you felt this kind of pressure. But I really enjoyed it, and I've got 2 more fiction books on the way, so it's nice to have the different forms to play with, I think. Well, we have a question.
Joshua just asked, do you think nice men are a minority?
No, I don't. I think they're the vast majority. I think if you look at, and this is, you know, coming from somebody who's spends her days and her entire life collating incidents that women have experienced at the hands of men, we're definitely talking about a tiny minority of men doing these things. Of course we are. The issue is recognizing that is still a problem that's valid and that we need to address. So often when you start talking about this stuff, you get this kind of response of, well, are you accusing all men of being like that? And the answer is no, of course not. But that's kind of not the point. The point is this is happening. A small, tiny number of men are doing it, but it's still enough to be affecting a really big number of women. So we still have to tackle it. I think that what we have probably is a tiny minority of men who are doing this stuff, a quite small group of men who know this stuff is happening and are really brilliant in calling it out and taking action and changing things. And then what I would say is the kind of critical mass, the biggest group of men who would never dream of behaving in this way themselves, but perhaps also don't know that the problem exists through no fault of their own, because it often does happen in a deserted street late at night or an empty copy room at work. You know, it is the kind of thing that you often might not have witnessed or been aware of if you are a man, unless you're a man who's experienced it themselves. So for me, the exciting thing is when we get all of those good men, the vast majority of men on board, once they become aware that this is happening, what all of them could then do as part of disrupting the normalization of this stuff and changing things is really exciting. And I think my best piece of advice for those nice men, of whom I'm sure there are lots listening today, is if you are one of those guys who doesn't necessarily know about this stuff, the easiest way in is to have a chat with women in your life who you care about. Ask your mum or your sister or a female friend or a girlfriend, if they feel comfortable, which they might not, talking to you about some of their own experiences. And I imagine the likelihood is it will be quite shocking and quite a good way to kind of open your eyes to what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, Bailey's just asked, What is the best way to tackle misogyny going forward?
Well, I think we have to tackle it on lots of different levels all at once. So I think we have to push for policy change. I think we have to try and get good representation in the places where people are making big legal and political decisions that affect the rest of our lives. For example, if you look at the people making decisions around COVID-19, they are hugely disproportionately middle class or rich white men. And what that means is that you can see in the policy decisions they've made how it's unequally impacted men and women. So, for example, at a really specific level, the self-employed income support scheme, it took a kind of overview of the last 3 years of your career to decide how much money you should be given, which sounds totally reasonable when you think about it at a kind of generalized level. But if there had been someone in that room that day who'd taken maternity leave, they might have been able to say, well, hang on a minute, that would have a really big impact. So what that means is that for millions of women across the country who've taken maternity leave in the last 3 years, they've been basically penalised for it in the amount of financial support that they can get during the pandemic. And there are so many other examples like that. If there had been someone in that room who'd experienced domestic abuse, then when they started talking about lockdown, they might have realised sooner that there was going to be a tragic high cost to pay for women who would be stuck with their abusers. Yeah. So I think we need better representation and policies, but we also need a kind of bottom-up approach, because policies are great. But for example, it's been illegal in the UK to discriminate against someone because they're pregnant for years and years now. But we also know still that 54,000 women a year lose their jobs because they get pregnant. So if people as a whole still believe in sexist ideas and attitudes, then policy change won't help on its own. And that's where all of you come in, really, because disrupting this kind of just normalized sexism and sexist language and sexist concepts whenever they cross our path, which they will inevitably at some point, whether it's on a WhatsApp group or an Instagram meme or walking down the street or sitting on the bus like the other people that day. At some point, this will happen in your earshot in front of you, and you'll have a choice to make about whether you're the person that speaks up and says something or the person who looks out the window. And it's the only way, that bravery of being the person that steps in is the only way to change this. Well, do I think education and schools could do more to educate students on these topics? Yes, I do. I'm really hopeful that the changes that I mentioned previously about sex and relationships education in schools will help with this. Because I think, schools really are about giving young people the information that they need and the tools that they deserve to navigate the world after school, right? So we teach young people to read and write because those are basic skills that they need to go through life. You learn about maths and you use that when you're counting your change to pay in a shop, for example. You learn about geography and map reading, and you use that when you go somewhere new and you want to find your way. Well, why shouldn't we also give people the tools that they deserve to navigate an equally comprehensive and universal life experience, which is having sex and relationships? This is something that almost all of us will experience. So why shouldn't we give young people the tools that they need to learn how to do that in a safe and healthy way at school? I think there's so much that schools could do. And just practically speaking, we can't really reach out and force everybody who's sexist in the world to sit down and listen to a chat about it or engage with this kind of conversation. But if we go into schools, we can actually catch everybody, and hopefully before the point where this all starts to become very normalized. So that's why I think schools are really important in tackling this. Are there any other questions?
Any other questions, folks? Do you think education could do more? Yeah. I mean, although I'm teaching sociology at this moment, I also teach some PSHE, and it's only been this year, this September, that the issue of consent and, like you say, has been actually explicitly talked about. Yeah. It's the language that's often been around it has been quite vague, or it's often been cloaked in, don't do things you don't feel comfortable with. And you think, okay, well, that's a bit woolly. What does that actually mean, or what does that look like?
And that puts the onus on people to say no rather than on other people to actually seek consent. Make sure that the person you're with wants to do these things.
Yeah. Okay, are there any more questions? Okay. Oh. Okay.
Thanks for sharing that, Alicia. And I'm so sorry that you've had that experience. Unfortunately, I think it's so common. And so many of us, I think, grow up just thinking we have to accept it and it's just normal. And actually, this really fits into the idea about power imbalance, because it often is a much older man making you feel really uncomfortable and unsafe. And it isn't a situation where you feel like you can necessarily say anything back because you don't know what might happen. And that's really important, because when we talk about catcalling, one of the most common responses is, oh, just take it as a compliment. You should enjoy it. And that totally misses the point, which is that it makes you feel unsafe, that it isn't wanted, that it's a power imbalance, that in that public space, then we're basically saying women's bodies are public property and men have the right to say and do whatever they want. So you're not alone, and it isn't normal and it shouldn't be.
On that note, or thanks for sharing, Alicia, has anyone else experienced anything like that, or an example of everyday sexism, either male or female? Yeah. I mean, because I know sometimes people say, well, that was meant as a joke, or that was meant as a compliment, and sometimes, you know, jokes can be made or compliments can be made, but like Laura said, if you feel uncomfortable or it makes you feel uncomfortable, then that's something entirely different, because it's different from someone saying, oh, you look nice, or that suits you, or I'm trying to think of the right context and also who's saying it. Yeah, so Eleanor, I'm sorry that you also have experienced that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's another really good example of that power dynamic, that idea that we're made to feel blamed and responsible for it, like there's something that you could do that would change it or protect yourself, when actually our society approaches this completely in the wrong way. Because we say things like, well, what was she wearing, or where was she, or what was she doing there late at night? And we see these posters even coming from police forces or universities saying things like, how to prevent yourself becoming a victim. And they're wrong, honestly. They statistically make no sense, but it's comfortable for us as a society because it kind of suggests, well, if women just did the right things, then rape wouldn't exist. But that's not the case. Rape is a deliberate act committed by criminals. And actually, we know it happens to women all over the world at all different times of day, in all different forms of dress, and at all different ages. And the only thing they have in common is coming into contact with a rapist. All of the statistics we have show that it doesn't make sense to say that a woman shouldn't wear a short skirt or go to the wrong place, because if you look at the fact that nearly 90% of rapists are already known to their victims, what that tells us is that you're probably safer in a dark alleyway in a short skirt at 2 o'clock in the morning than you would be in your pajamas at home in bed. Because actually it's much more likely a colleague, a partner, a husband, a boyfriend, a friend who commits rape. It isn't a shadowy stranger in a dark alleyway.
And also just the very act represented by Alicia's comment, it makes me question what I should wear when I'm leaving the house. If you're having to do that all the time, or you're having to kind of almost double back on yourself, not only does that make you lose your sense of power, but also gives you no sense of identity, because it's like, well, I have to mold myself always, or change myself in response to society. So it makes people powerless, or lose power. Yeah. Any other experiences anybody wants to share, or any other questions? I mean, I'm sure if you felt comfortable, you would be welcome to post your comments on the project, would they, Laura?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much for having me and for having this conversation, which has been really great.
Yeah. Apologies for the technical issues, but thank you very much, folks. Can I ask you now a couple of things? First of all, can we extend a full virtual round of applause to Laura and thank her for her time?
Thank you.
Yeah, it's been really fantastic to talk to you. Okay. And I hope that, there are some fantastic, well, everyone in our class is great, but I know proportionately there are fewer men than women, And I just want to make it clear that when we're talking about men, we're not making any reference to anybody in this class. You all are great. And the fact that you're asking questions, Bailey, Samuel, Joshua, is an indication that you're really encouragingly on board with what we're talking about. So we need more of that. So maybe if you can lead by example and share stories, that would be great. Okay. Right, can I ask you folks just to hold on for a moment whilst I just explain what I'd like you to do over the half-term break, because this is the last lesson before we pause for a holiday, even though we haven't been in school. But in calendar wise it's time for half term. But just say thank you to Laura again, and thank you so much, Laura, and I'll be in touch with you shortly. Thank you so much.
Thanks everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.